Good evening, everyone. My name is Freddie Hai. I'm the director of Rocco Design Architects. I'm very honored to be here to give you this talk. Now, since it's getting quite late now, without further ado, I'll just proceed with the presentation. Hong Kong is a city of bridges. As we all know, we are quite accustomed to the idea of traversing across urban roads and areas without actually the need of getting down to the ground. And especially for the compact living environment of Hong Kong, we have developed a quite unique way of urban context for the people to make a living, and also to build the habitat around railway stations, major infrastructures, and things like that. Now, the idea of connecting different spaces and areas through connection network of bridges is not new. It is as old as you can remember from the history of the ancient times. But what actually happened is we all know that from the medieval times, we always have the aspiration to build higher and taller. This is not just an aspiration on the engineering side, but it also represents a period of our societies, mainly governed by religious doctrines and reaching out to the sky. So there's always this human aspirations of building higher and upper. Until such a time, we start to realize that there's obviously a distinction between architecture and city. Whereas architecture or building represents the individuality, city is the conglomerate, the interrelations, and the connectivity of all of us, how we live together. And therefore, this connectivity issue becomes apparent. If we look back into history, one of the famous model, as you can see in this slide, the Königsberg town with the famous 7 bridges, immortalized by the mathematical propositions of which eventually led to the graph theory, asking whether one could transverse all 7 bridges in one direction in a single trip without doubling back. This city was in the old Eastern Prussian area, now part of Prussian area, now becomes part of Russia now. And the idea of connecting the city via different bridges have become a necessity for the livelihood of the people, for the defense of the city, for the expansion need of the growth of the city. And the idea of connecting with bridges usually come with the constraint of the natural landscape, a river, gorges, or other natural elements. This is another old example from the 13th century, the Ponte Vecchio from Florence. We all know that bridges had not just been a bridge for transverse, but it was also used as habitation. And many of you might have been here as tourists or visitors, and nowadays, of course, it is lined with shops for tourists, for selling souvenirs and interesting artifacts. But in the old days, when this place was first developed and built, the two sides of the houses were mainly used by butchers, tanners, and farmers. Very mundane jobs, and it's part of the everyday life. So it is well integrated into the society and used by everyone. as part of the city. So it is not uncommon for us to always live on a bridge or extend the city to overcome physical constraints of nature. Another example, this time in Spain, in Ponte Novo, is a 18th century construction dominated by this magnificent bridge connection. It's actually a viaduct connecting the two sides of the city ronda over the El Tajo Gorge, the very deep gorge below. This magnificent structure becomes a critical infrastructure connecting the two sides of the city, which was separated by the natural element. This also shows the human endeavor to overcome difficulties and to make life connected and the society as a whole. Of course, our fascination with the bridges connecting different levels not just happened in the past, but it gets escalated into this wild imagination through the advance in moving images. In the beginning of the 20th century, when people started to discover cinema and movie and the filming technology, ideas sprout up, and people are fascinated by what the future city could be like. This is a very classic, iconic image from the movie The Metropolis, made in 1927, where the future of the city had been depicted as one conglomerate of super high-rises, skyscrapers, interconnected with high-tech bridges at different levels. And the interesting thing is, for the first time, we started to see the integration of living habitats with transportation. So in the past, in the previous example I was showing, the connectivity were made mainly for pedestrians and sometimes used by carts and carriages. But the first sign of fully integrated lifestyle, including living habitats and transportation, happens in the 20th century. This is another very famous iconic image from the architect Harvey Corbett. He is known for being the master of skyscrapers, responsible for many buildings in New York. And he was pioneering the technique and engineering of building very tall and very high up buildings. But he was educated as an engineer and also in the Beaux-Arts tradition of architecture. You can see that the architecture depicted in this picture is rather classical, in the sense that it still follows the Beaux-Arts tradition with the arches and the wrought iron element supporting the transversing bridges. But the interesting thing is you started to see a multi-layering concept being depicted in 1913 in his book, the Imagined City of the Future. Another interesting thing is it's not just multi-level, it is multi-modes of transportation. Apart from pedestrian, you can see that it is a mixture of railway lines and also mass transit system by way of buses and coaches. And there are also different levels of pedestrian connectivity. So this is a very forward-looking, innovative, and aspiring diagram almost a century ago. Then, of course, came Le Corbusier with his Radiant City. He pioneered this concept of high rises, residential building with interconnected communal spaces. And in this drawing, we can see some references to the Harvey Corbett concept. But also in this case, we started to see integration of the green element. And in the concept of Le Corbusier, he always tried to concentrate the living habitats into high-rise residential blocks and leaving the ground plane open for parks. Now, nowadays, of course, we always copy the first part of his vision, which is concentrating people living in high-rises, without copying the second part of his vision, which is leaving the ground plane as park. This is, of course, a result of the building economics, but let's not forget the total concept of living is not just putting people in high rises, but also the emphasis of open spaces. Then also Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, we cannot talk about architecture without him. In his thesis, he actually proposed the idea of the Broadacre City. Now, interestingly, the Broadacre City is an anti-city. What do you mean by anti-city? He was actually conceiving a kind of living habitat without going into the fashionable suburban sprawling residential the district culture. He was envisioning a city of a self-contained city with offices and residential buildings and also transportation modes outside of the city center, but in the suburb of the city center, without the need to go into very small scale the suburbia that we see today. As we move along the timeline, the technology advances and new imagination came along, and with all these ideas and the possibilities opened up by the latest technology also put into the city, literally taking the word putting into a city. Therefore, the plug-in city concept came not as a surprise from the archigram in the 60s and 70s. Imagining that this city we can just put in functions. Now, the interesting thing is, although these drawings looks like a kindergarten drawing, but the idea behind that all these functions are like modular elements that we can plug in. We just need to add in functions to enrich the city life, to make life interesting, to make a city vibrant. We can plug in these elements as we wish. It's a very powerful and futuristic idea with a lot of foresight. At least in the UK, the idea of separating the habitat and the transportation had been in the thinking for a long time. The first large-scale development of this type came in the 50s and 60s with the development of the Barbican Center. Now, the Barbican is the first large-scale development advocated to this kind of idea of separating the living area and the transportation, completely separated the pedestrian zone and the transport zone, making a safe space for the pedestrian. It also creates large expanse of open space and interconnected communal areas without the risk of the traffic below interfering. Of course, if you look back now with the then fashionable brutalistic design style, the space looked bleak. Of course, right now, if we were to do a re-evaluation of this design, there would be a substantial lack of landscaping and greenery to make this space more amicable. But the idea of separating traffic and the pedestrian was experimented and also implemented with a certain degree of success, because we then start to see how communities could be developed with this enhanced connectivity. Coming back to Hong Kong, our city develops over a very short period of time compared to the major cities in the world. In the 50s, we were basically living in 10, 12-story buildings. But by the time of the 2010, the super high-rise became something like 40 or 50 stories. Like the building is 5 times taller than what they were a half a century ago. With this emphasis of going higher and taller, buildings becomes giant pillars in the urban context. But we also developed something interesting and quite unique in Hong Kong. That is the podium approach, that every estate or tower blocks is supported by a self-sufficient or at least certain elements of commercial activities at the first few floors, usually the first 3 floors, housing the daily necessities and the errands of necessities for the habitats above. And then this podium is also connected to a nearby transport infrastructure, making mass transit very efficient, very sustainable, and also making the intra-district connectivity possible. Now, of course, with this, we are building more and more footbridges, more and more horizontal connections between podiums, between different environments. We then need to start to stop just building this for functionality and for simple connectivity, but to think, what can we do to improve this new form of habitation? That is, you spend so much time traversing from one area to the other area horizontally, above ground, above the traffic, in a car-free environment. We started to think about what more can we introduce into this form of connection beyond just functionality. This is an interesting diagram of Central. Of course, you probably don't recognize the shape of the buildings. They have been abstractized into just boxes with the names on it. But you can see the footbridge connections of Central, how people are connected without the need of touching the ground. That is an interesting network in its own right, and deserves us to look into more detail how these spaces could work better and to make the city a more coherent piece of living environment. And to a certain extent, we are not just extending the bridges from buildings to buildings, we are extending the bridges and escalators connections from district to district. This is a very famous project done 20 years ago, had been a subject of investigation in the world, connecting Central to the mid-levels and facilitating the communities above and below on their daily commuting between the two districts. But looking back, is there anything we can learn from this exercise? And is there anything we can move on to progress from it for the next generation connection mode? We try to look to some interesting foreign projects. This one is from New York, the very famous Skyline project. It was a defunct railway line, elevated viaduct railway line, and the city council was on the verge of demolishing the railway line, and then it was intervened, and somebody proposed a very daring and interesting idea of why don't we keep the railway line, the viaduct, but to change the defunct viaduct into an urban park, an elevated urban park, give some green space back to the city, but it doesn't need to take away the ground floor. The project has been a phenomenal success. It has been published worldwide, and it is a key feature of New York Now. I'm sure if you go to New York now, and your friends will probably bring you to the High Line to have a nice stroll in the afternoon, to enjoy sitting around, just simply be there with the green and among the buildings from a different perspective. Another interesting project, this time in Asia, in Seoul, a very close by country to Hong Kong. Again, in Hong Kong, our typical highway structure, the highway bridges are purely functional. And the fact that you propose to put some plants in the highway bridges will scare many officers with a pale face, because that would obstruct and take away the effective width of the thoroughfare. But in this project, the elevated walkway is dotted with different sizes of planters with substantial planting to improve the walking environments from one space to another, and therefore making the connection not just a programmatic, functional exercise, but an enjoyable walk and experience in its own right. What we can learn from these two projects is that the functional need doesn't need to stop just there. There could be more to go into the functional need to make it an interesting and memorable experience. Coming back to Hong Kong, this was the IFC. This is the IFC development. We worked on it something like 25 years ago. Our office was the architect for the whole development. And when we proposed this development, as you remember, it was a reclaimed land, and it was basically a flat reclaimed land with nothing. So the entire development, with the station box construction for the airport as express railway, was constructed with the idea of bringing the activity from the then center of Central to the waterfront. That is, how do we bring the people from Pedder Street area, from the Queens Road area to the waterfront, starting from scratch with nothing. So naturally, the idea of connecting with different footbridges to make the connections is very important, because there are many roads to cross. Queens Road, the Through Road, and also the Connaught Road, the three major thoroughfare with very heavy traffic. And therefore, elevated footbridge connection becomes a very natural choice for us. But what is more that we propose is that instead of just connecting with footbridges, we were looking into how do we enhance the experience of crossing? How do we enhance the experience of this newfound elevated land in the air. What do we do with it, and what are the opportunities it offers? And with the IFC project, we noticed that the creation of spaces is very important. The creation of these small, identifiable urban spaces at elevated level, surrounded with natural landscape, is very important to make the space pleasant, to make them intermittent destinations, to propel the circulation of the people. And of course, nowadays people remember the iconic Apple Store on the retail mall, but few would realize the Apple Store was actually a store in the air. It is a store built on the footbridge across a major road, and therefore the concept of uh, propelling people, the footfall of the circulation with activities alongside, with the commercial elements alongside, is very important to capture the critical mass of the circulation to make the space vibrant. Next project, this time is in Shenzhen in China. We are the architects of Qianhai, this project in Shenzhen, Qianhai Exchange Square. The brief was very interesting. In the beginning, this area consisted of 6 lots, 6 individual lots with 3 rows transversing and bisecting all the lots into individual 6 lots. It was a competition, and we won the design competition with the job. Our concept was very simple. Instead of 6 lots, we created a interconnected deck, creating a town center, creating a focus for this newly developed area of Qianhai, and also making this a landmark for Qianhai. Instead of developing the 6 lots individually, we developed it as one big conglomerate site with functions appropriately dispositioned, with offices, residential, hotel, retail, and everything to make this a comprehensively functional as well as pleasant environment. This decking over also serves the fact that we are hiding all the transports and car park facilities down below, making this a car-free zone at the elevated deck. In this project, we also learned that in order for it to function and to work, it is not just the physical connectivity, but you have to create physical interfaces with the different spaces so as to create opportunities for the activities. The opportunities for activities is like a chessboard you set up and let it evolve organically with the functions and the commercial activities, well calculated but not too defined, and give some air for it to develop in the long run. The next project, it's back to Hong Kong. This is the East Kowloon Cultural Center in Ngau Tau Kok. On the right-hand side, you can see the newly developed Ngau Tau Kok estate. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Ngau Tau Kok MTR station. The site is a triangular wedge shape squeezed in between a very high density residential area and a major transportation terminus. In this wedge shape, we have to fit in a 1,200 seat theater, a 600 seat smaller theater, and numerous other cultural facilities. What we decide to do is, instead of having connection points to the station and to the residential tower on the right, we make sure that the circulation of the people in their daily lives must pass through the complex, the cultural complex. And therefore, because of the commuting every day, the people will be exposed to the events of the theaters. And the cultural events will become an interesting, ever-changing facade of activities along the way, and therefore making the journey pleasurable and different every day, every week. We create this circulation system that very intricately overlaid and would not interfere with the ticketed circulation, with the open and uninterrupted public circulation, so that the people traversing the area during the daytime and nighttime peak hour to the station can pass through these areas and then be informed of the cultural activities. In so doing, we hope that people's life could be enriched by the cultural events. These are some internal views of the theater, lobby, and foyer area. We are expecting this to complete early next year. And the external area is also a series of circulation ramps and stairs connecting to the neighboring districts over the two motorways, highways on the two sides. So with the three previous project experience, we know that we need to create commercial activities and create enough activities to activate the space. We need greenery. We need greenery to make the space more pleasant, more responsive to the season, and also more environmentally sustainable. We also know the idea of creating sufficient physical interfaces to make this as an area poised for organic growth, to allow opportunities for people to take ownership of the space and develop it according to the natural process. We also know that we need to introduce some culture to enrich the lives of the people. These are the strategies that we use to ensure the objectives of the Green Deck are fulfilled. That is to improve the air quality and community health, rebuild the community connectivity, to satisfy the social needs by enhancing local amenities, and also finally revitalizing the urban centers and the local economy, which is important to sustain the working of this concept. And in this project, we have created so many different new connections, also with the old connections, so that the idea of having this raised car-free zone becomes a destination in its own right. So these are just some images of the deck area at a pedestrian level. So this is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed the project, and we look forward to it coming to fruition soon. Thank you.